I like it. Most politicians like it. Even recovering politicians like being asked to do easy things. But also I'm pleased to be part of the presidential debate on these issues. I was elected, I served for Congress in a decade from North Carolina, my home state. I served for that decade on the House Financial Services Committee. I read in the Washington Post a couple days that I am considered a leader on financial reform issues. How did I come to be considered a leader on financial reform issues? And it was not entirely my expectation. The advice I got when I was elected to Congress was that the House, unlike the Senate, is a thundering herd, 435 members. You can go down to the floor every time they turn the C-SPAN cameras on and try to speak. But if you want to make a contribution, pick some technical issue that nobody else is working on and work on that issue, try to master that issue. So the issue I claimed was subprime mortgage lending. It proved not to be quite the path to obscurity that I thought that it was in 2003. Center for Responsible Lending, a North Carolina advocacy group, asked me to take on the issue. I did introduce predatory mortgage lending legislation in 2004. They later admitted to me that they had first approached the then senior senator from my state, John Edwards, to ask that he champion the issue. At that time, he was trying to position himself as a Southern centrist to run for president, because that was thought to be the profile that was most electable for a Democrat. So they did not tell me that others had turned down the issue because they thought it was career limiting. 4 years later, of course, John Edwards did everything short of seeing the Internationale at campaign rallies to try to move to the left. And I think there are a good many national Democrats who wish that they had taken on that issue as early as 2003 to 2004. And some of them now remember that they were strong supporters of that legislation, that they were unstinting, zealous champions of that legislation, and I'm pleased to have support, even if it's somewhat retroactive. I did win some fights in that decade in coming to be considered a leader on financial reform. We did, as part of the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010, enact predatory mortgage lending legislation. It was a little late at that point, still important for the future. We created a CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, to try to protect against at least the worst abuses in consumer finance. But there are very many issues on which I feel like I did not win. I may have led, but I led in defeat. The median household net worth in the 5 years after the financial crisis fell by 40%. The life savings of a typical median American family. For African American families and for Latinos families, the foreclosure crisis was almost an extinction event. There are communities around the country, notably Detroit, which has been called the black capital of America. They were almost destroyed by the foreclosure crisis. So yes, economic justice issues are racial justice issues. So I do feel like I lost on a lot of issues, and I'm very well aware that the struggle, the fight, is not over. And I'm pleased that Governor Malley wanted to hold this event to talk about where we are now, where we should go from here. I guess if the Democratic Party has moved as far left as the Wall Street Journal's editorial page says we have, or the New Republic, I should say, what is to be done. But Governor Malley, thank you for hosting this event, or putting this event on.
Hey, Congressman, thank you, and thanks very much for agreeing to be here today for this discussion, followed by some questions and answers. I really appreciate everything that you brought to this issue. I mean, when our Congress actually works well, we would expect to see Congress people taking on issues and developing some expertise and to contribute to not only better and deeper and broader understanding, but also to better actions that actually protect the well-being of our national interests. So, Congressman, thank you for diving into this one and for being ahead of the curve on this. And and for the good that you have done for our country on this score. Let me share with you a few opening thoughts. I mean, the genius of our country is that in every generation we find ways to include more and more of our citizens more fully in the social, the political, and the economic life of our country. And so the actions that we've taken to do that include keeping wages tracking with productivity, making the investments we can only make as a people and in new industries and our own infrastructure and the discovery of new solutions to human challenges, a sensible immigration system. But another one is a balanced and predictable rule of law. The financial industry of our nation is extremely important to the proper economic functioning of our entire country. It is extremely important to the growth of a more diverse and inclusive middle class. And that is why the issue of following through with the promise of Wall Street reform is so very important to the common good that we share as a people. Paul Volcker has said very recently that we are in just as grave a danger today as we were 8 years ago of another crash. And we all know what happened in that one. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of people lost their homes. Grinding mechanisms that were taking homes from people in, all over Maryland. And I stood in line with the people of my state when we, in a time of revenue downturn because of the economic downturn, we had to shell out millions of dollars to set up nonprofit housing counseling centers all over the state and then target them and put them in those places where the suffering was most intense. So I stood in line. I looked into the faces of people who had everything they'd ever worked for in their life taken away from them. So this is an issue that I've had a lot of experience with from the standpoint of those who were most adversely impacted. Secondly, I want to share with you just a couple of commitments to strengthen and grow our middle class, including our family-owned businesses and our family farms, to improve public safety and public education, to expand opportunity to more people rather than fewer, and to stand up to powerful, wealthy special interests whenever they try to run roughshod over the people of our state. I can recite that by heart because I said it 1,000 times. Not yesterday, not last year, but in 2005 and 2006 when I ran for governor of the state of Maryland. A state which even through the recession defended both a AAA bond rating and the highest median income of any state in America, and the second highest median income for African American households. What the Pew Foundation ranked as one of the top 3 best states for upward economic mobility. So in my record, while some would call it economic populism at the time, I called it doing what works. Making the investments, passing things like a living wage, standing up to, in our state, the big issue we had was with energy and our utility industry, appointing independent people to our Public Service Commission, decoupling the consumer from the profit motive, moving to a more distributed, predictable, stable energy future, and putting consumers' interests first rather than the interests of powerful, wealthy few. And on this issue, I don't believe anyone could credibly run for president without offering a framework for how it is that we deliver on Wall Street reform. It's still a grave threat to our national economy, and we need to follow through. And that's what I've done. My training has been as a lawyer, and so this is not so very complicated that we can't understand it. I mean, look, 2 issues just to make it to be crystal clear. If you slap a bank robber on the wrist, he's going to keep robbing more banks. The same's true if the person wears a suit. Secondly, I mean, when you look at the lack of enforcement and the lack of staff at SEC, and the CFTC. It hasn't changed since the 1990s, and yet deregulation led to this concentration of power, where now instead of 20% of, where you have 60% of the banks or 60% of the assets are controlled by just 5 banks, and yet you don't see the increase in the budget for the entities that are supposed to be regulating this, and I'm sure, and that's because of the influence being exerted in Congress. The industry, at least those 4 or 5 banks that control it, don't want increased enforcement of Wall Street. And they push back on it in the halls of Congress, Republican-controlled Congress. It's as if Al Capone setting the budget for the Chicago Police Department. We need to restore effective deterrence and enforcement to protect our common good.
You mentioned the revolving door, and that has been more of an issue recently than ever in the past. Obscure regulatory policy positions are now becoming very high profile. Elizabeth Warren said at Netroots Nation last week that personnel is policy, and has made it very clear, as have others, that those positions will not go through unexamined, certainly in this administration or presumably in the next administration. The most visible fights are perhaps unfair. I've never met Antonio Weiss. I have never met Keir Goodens. Both of them have very strong credentials, appear to be very talented. And as I said, I've never met Antonio Weiss, but I did write a op-ed or a blog, I guess it's called, in the Huffington Post, opposing his nomination. And I said in that he may be punished for the sins of others, and maybe unfairly, but his principal qualification seems to be that he comes from the same background and the same culture as so many policy makers with whom many of us are unhappy with the policy result. Keir Goodens, a lot of the criticism of him has been unfair. He is acting as a lawyer advising clients, and sometimes what the clients want to do is not regarded as the Lord's own work. But that's not really the role of a lawyer. A lawyer is not a spiritual advisor. So if a client says, "Can I do this legally?" the lawyer's not really supposed to say, "Well, yes, you can do that legally, but you really should not."
Maybe that's why I didn't have many clients.
Yeah. Well, there are some things where you should tell them they should not. But how do you go about? I mean, we have had a set of policymakers who view economic policy as something that should be controlled by technocrats. It shouldn't be publicly debated. They haven't particularly welcomed the viewpoints of anyone who's not part of their group. There's a criticism in Europe, or debate in Europe, about the extent to which policymaking has a democracy deficit. But there hasn't been exactly a surplus of democracy in our economic policy making either. How do you go about picking the folks for economic policy positions and regulatory positions to make sure we have a balance of views and make sure that folks really are doing what is in the public good, not the good of their once and future clients and business associates?
I'm the only candidate in this race who has 15 years of executive experience actually making those appointments of personnel, both to regulatory boards, cabinet secretaries, and the like. This is one of what I have always strived to accomplish, especially when it comes to regulatory agencies, is to appoint people with not only the expertise but also the independence to do what is in the public's interest. And that has meant some long searches, frankly, in order to attract people to government service that have both that combination of expertise and also the independence from the industry to do the job. If one were to go back, one of the important things that we have to do right now as a nation is to restore the public's trust that that we can actually follow through on Wall Street reform. Because by many objective measures, we have not. And when experts are saying that we're still in grave danger, that puts an extra onus on us right now, especially as a self-governing people, to make sure independent people are appointed to these boards and commissions, to make sure that we have a fresh start, which is why it's important not only to shut the revolving door, but it's also important to make a commitment not to appoint those who were the architects of Wall Street deregulation back to key positions policing Wall Street. That's not to say that they were necessarily ill-intended when deregulation happened, but given the economic suffering that was brought about, given the crash, and given our failure to follow through, I think that we are not out of bounds to conclude as citizens that there is a coziness between this industry. There is an accumulation of calcified wealth and power that has prevented us from following through on protecting our common good here. So I think you need to do both a fresh start, and I think you need to find independent people. You need to pay them more, probably, and you need to, and you probably need to look for those that are either at the end of their career, at the beginning of their career, or career civil service sort of people in order to find that expertise. And another way you can do it is to draw people from, oftentimes from state service or federal service. I mean, the federal government is not our only layer of government. In other words, I know when we were looking for people to appoint to our Public Service Commission, I think we drew from from FERC and some experience of at least one appointee I remember there, when our issue was that utilities had accumulated too much political power in our state.
My advice to any Democratic presidential candidate is if you pick for top economic policy positions the people that appear to be part of the permanent policy establishment, Democratic policy establishment, and then let them pick the rest. They will all pick each other. They will run the administration, and your role will be that of celebrity spokesman for the administration.
Right. Here's the music from the choir, right? Sing along. I could not agree with you more. I mean, you can't expect. We need a fresh start here. We need to appoint new people. We're not such a small country that we can't find new people, new perspectives that were not part of the deregulation effort to begin with. I sometimes call it, Congressman, the bridge over the River Kwai syndrome.
Right.
Sometimes people become so enamored of the things that they have worked on that they lose sight of the larger goal and the larger purpose. Great David Lean movie.
Mark Toma, is a very well-credentialed academic economist. He writes a blog called Economics View. And another bit of free advice I would give to anyone who, any Democratic president, is try to find some sources of information that aren't fed to you. For one thing, it keeps your staff off guard.
Nothing annoys them more than knowing that the principal is reading.
Because you have some basis of information other than what they have handed you. And if you leave them with the impression that you read the entire internet every morning, they will not leave anything out when they talk to you. But if you're looking for one source, I would recommend Mark Toma's blog, among others. But Mark Toma had a piece a couple days ago that I thought was very smart. And he said he was kind of torn between the argument that in the financial crisis, or perhaps any kind of crisis, the response, that there's a question of whether it's better to act quickly, to strike while the iron is hot, when public attention is on it, and therefore the greatest support for changes will be there, or to take your time, develop strong policies, well thought through policies, and they may be better policies, but the problem is during that time, the public's attention has diverted, opposition has gotten their feet back under them and has regrouped, and it's harder to pass. We certainly saw that with respect to Wall Street reform. The Obama administration's package didn't come until the late summer of 2009. The public was furious in January and February of 2009 over the AIG bonuses and everything else. And we lost some of that. Another frustration of mine from that period is we were flat-footed. The people who would support reform in Congress really did not know the financial crisis was coming. Others did. Others in government did. They didn't tell us.
You mean on the executive side?
On the executive side, very.
Were there any in Congress who were saying, "Man, I see this coming"?
Not that I recall.
Uh-huh.
And I think I would have been in on those conversations. So when Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson came to Congress in mid-September and said the world was going to end shortly unless you passed this immediately, we were unprepared. We had no set of proposals on the shelf. We were not ready. And they had known, according to some of the books published about the crisis, they had a memo from the time that Bear Stearns ran into trouble called the Break the Glass Memo for what the bailout would look like. They didn't mention a word to anyone in Congress. There weren't proposals on the shelf. I know that a lot of your proposals are proposals that Congress wouldn't pass now. I think that's fine. You should develop the agenda and have the debate.
And the consensus.
Well, I mean, a new 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act is not going to pass Congress now, the Congress we have now. Doubling the CFTC budget and SEC budget, you're absolutely right about that. Financial Transactions Act, absolutely right. All of that requires Congress, and Congress is not going to do that unless maybe there's a crisis, and then it may be possible to do a lot more. Do you have proposals on the shelf, or will you develop proposals on the shelf from perhaps more ambitious reform, so that we get to that Lehman moment that we had in September 2008, we are ready with much more ambitious reforms that we can push through when the iron is hot.
Yeah, I believe that every election, especially every national election, is the opportunity for a deeper understanding. And understanding precedes action. And so just as all of us can agree that we're not going to be here forever, neither is this particular Congress. And so I think real leadership is to forge a new consensus, not to follow or submit to the straitjacket of the way things are today. So I intend to forge a new consensus by leading with these ideas, by campaigning on these ideas, and by winning on these ideas. Second, there are things that we can do that make a huge difference, just in terms of the people we appoint to the Department of Justice, to the SEC, to the other entities that are responsible for regulation. And already in Dodd-Frank, it is required that these mega big banks, the too big to fail, too big to jail, apparently too big to manage banks, execute living wills. And that in the absence of their ability to show us and to put forward a plan as to how they would dissolve or downsize in the event of a threat posed to our economy, that then we step in and we take the actions that we must. One of those would be to greatly increase their capital cushion, thereby making it probably more advantageous for them to limit their size. And these are things that I intend to push as President of the United States as we build a consensus for these things to pass in Congress. And once those things happen, I think it'll become easier to push some of these things through Congress.
It is very apparent that despite the progress that CFPB has made, which I don't minimize at all, we still have a huge problem in consumer financial services for lower income Americans and really the entire middle class as well. The Inspector General of the Post Office a year or so ago issued a report that suggested that post offices do again what they did for half a century up until the 60s and provided certain basic banking services at post offices. So there's a branch almost anywhere, a branch bank bank almost anywhere that there's a post office, which is in a great many neighborhoods in America. But the IG's report said that for the unbanked or lightly banked, the underbanked Americans, which is about 30% of all Americans, their household incomes are just shy of $30,000. They are spending 10% of their gross income on financial services.
Right, and that's 50% on rent.
Yeah, and some of that is completely no-risk stuff, check cashing, prepaid debit cards, remittances. Some of it may be, consumer lending, which may be a little more difficult for the banks, for the post office to take over. But what would you do about consumer lending and consumer financial services generally? And what do you think of the idea of allowing the post office? You mentioned earlier there are a lot of things that the president can do without Congress, but what the IG proposed is something the president or the management of the post office could do without Congress.
Yeah, well, I like the idea of the post office becoming more engaged in this. As mayor of Baltimore, we were always pushing back against the payday loans and the check cashing operations that rip off poor families. We had some success over time. A couple of times as governor, we raised our earned income tax credit and used that as an opportunity to kind of get people into some free financial counseling on their tax returns, and thereby get them and steer them into better banking services. So I'd be open to the post office idea. It might even be a way to better fund the post office. I mean, gee, Denise, if they just charged a fraction of what these rip-off check cashing people do.
That was actually part of the IG's rationale for doing it, and the postal unions, or at least ATWU, is strongly in favor of the idea because the post office is struggling for funding to try to do what we expect of them.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Can I say one other thing? Sure. I meant to say it when you kindly gave me the Mark Troma suggestion. Recently read this book called The Bullies of Wall Street, How Greed Messed Up Our Economy. And it's written by former FDIC chair Sheila Bair. And I've never met Sheila Bair. She was appointed by during the Bush administration, I think.
She worked for Dole on his Senate staff.
And then continued on and worked for President Obama. But it is a very clear and fascinating insider read and explanation of what was going on at the time that the crisis was faced, and also about the culture that took over many of these siloed regulatory departments, where they started taking on the attributes and the cultures of the very people they were supposed to be regulating. And you can't really say that she has a partisan bias. So anyway, it's a very good read. And I've never met her, though she does now. She is now the president of one of the great and most idyllic and beautiful campuses in Maryland at Washington College in Chestertown, on the banks of the Chester River.
Critics of Wall Street reform say that the reformers are anti-market, that we don't want to let market forces work. But Elizabeth Warren has made the point when she spoke at the National Press Club 2 or 3 months ago. Apparently, she did fit into their criteria, that reform or some rules are actually required to make market forces work. The way the market is supposed to work is that there's competition. It squeezes costs, including executive compensation. It squeezes profits, but we have seen the profits of Wall Street explode. At the time of the crisis, or just before, 40% of all corporate profits were in the financial sector. And the overall size of the financial sector has doubled. And of course, compensation has gone through the roof. So it is pretty apparent that the switch for market forces is in the off position. How do you see financial reform affecting market, making market forces work?
Well, I think that's the challenge of our times, is how do we redirect investment into the real economy and the more productive economy, the economy that actually builds and expands human solutions to human problems, and that the rest of us can buy and purchase. That's the great challenge. You mentioned the on and off switch. A different take on that from 15 years of executive experience as a mayor and a governor is that sometimes in government there's two speeds, on and off. And I think we absolutely have switched to off the fairness and competitiveness in this particular industry, which is actually the opposite of capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. And when you concentrate power to the extent that only 4 or 5 mega big banks control 60% of the assets, that's not free competition. That's not a level playing field. I was talking to a guy who's the head of a community bank recently in a small town in Iowa, and he said, you know, the other problem is, Governor, good money starts to follow bad money. When the big banks are so reckless in their bets and their speculation, that almost forces the smaller banks to follow suit. So in order to have a competitive economy, Woodrow Wilson used to say, shortly after the last great rebalancing that we faced after the Gilded Age, he said, freedom also means freedom from monopolies and freedom from monopolistic power. And that's what we're talking about here where Wall Street reform is concerned. It is about restoring capitalism. It is about pushing back against monopolistic power. It is about restoring a rule of law that applies to everyone. Right now, we've allowed ourselves to create 2 rules of law. One is for the select, too big to jail, too big to fail, too big to manage banks of Wall Street that all of us were at least one time already forced to bail out. And then another rule for the rest of us. And that's not the way a competitive capitalist economy is supposed to work. Which also might explain why we have such anemic growth.
There's actually a struggle now between the left and the right over whose phrase, what whose criticism of crony capitalism is. Both use the phrase and say it is their criticism of the economy, not the others. I know we were supposed to at some point turn to questions. So no, I'm fine with we can move to questions from the audience now. Should I call upon them, or do you want to? All right. Yes, ma'am.
Anita Gallagher with Executive Intelligence Review. Very interesting talk. Thank you so much. I wonder, when you made your first point, Governor, that you would restore Glass-Steagall. You know, there are 2 bills in Congress for Glass-Steagall. Elizabeth Warren's introduced the bill, 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act, Senate Bill 1709. Marcy Kaptur's introduced Return to Prudential Banking, House Resolution 381, and there's also a companion bill in the House to Elizabeth Warren's.
Which Elijah Cummings of Maryland, I think, has his name on, right? I just wanted to give him a shout out anyway if he does.
I'm sure he will, if he doesn't. But I wonder if you see using your campaign to actually help these bills get enacted, you know, in this Congress, you know, right now, because we need them immediately. And secondly, I imagined perhaps that you emphasized a modern Glass-Steagall Act, and I would ask you, what's wrong with the old one, if anything?
Yeah. Let me answer the first part first. I would hope that the conversation in this campaign, and I would hope that if other Democratic candidates follow this call to reinstitute Glass-Steagall, that could well be an impetus for helping this bill to pass. And I was glad to see in the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act that included in there some provisions on revolving door, something that I had proposed a couple of weeks ago. No, I thought there was, with regard to the revolving door. Look, I believe that every day we wake up as Americans looking towards the future. It's important to learn from the past, but we also look for modern solutions to our modern problems. I suppose that's why the authors of the bill call it a modern Glass-Steagall. And maybe you know the answer to that one, given your expertise, Congressman. What was wrong with the old Glass-Steagall?
Well, I wasn't around to vote to repeal it, so I will claim no responsibility for that. I do think that the biggest banks become too big and too complex. And there are two approaches. Elizabeth Warren has said the same thing. She's been the champion of the modern Glass-Steagall Act. But Sherrod Brown and I introduced legislation to cap the overall size of banks. If you make banks less complex, which the Glass-Steagall, a new version of Glass-Steagall would do, they'll be smaller. If you make them smaller, they'll be less complex. They can still do anything you need a bank to do in the economy. There is no real reason that 10 $300 billion banks can't do what one $3 trillion bank can do. You had your hand up earlier.
Thank you, Governor O'Malley. Thank you, Representative Miller. I have to say, go Hills with you. It's Eric Garcia, economics reporter at the National Journal. So, one thing that I'm interested in is, like Representative Miller said, Senator Sanders has taken fire and has been seen as an anti-Wall Street, and has also criticized Wall Street along with you. But I haven't seen like a white paper along the lines of what you've seen. How do you plan to differentiate yourself with Senator Sanders and say to people that you are, like Congressman Miller said, that you're the right candidate for Democrats who are skeptical of Wall Street, that you're the right candidate for them? How do you plan to differentiate yourself from Senator Sanders on that? And second of all, on your living wills provision, how exactly do you ensure that when it comes to living wills, if they're turned down, how do you plan to instruct the Fed to break up these banks or put more pressure on them without compromising the independence of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. The Dodd-Frank is actually what requires the living wills, but apparently the way the Fed is dealing with it right now, unlike the way our professors dealt with us on term papers in college, is that if you don't submit a living will, you get a 6-month extension to come up with another living will. Some of these living wills, I'm told, are thousands of pages long, and I think as thinking Americans, we're all, I think, entitled to the inference that if the banks, after 5 years, 6 or 7 years, can't themselves come up with a way to create a living will that would prevent the collapse of their institution from bringing down the economy, then I think we're entitled to the inference that it's not possible, and that their size and the lack of Glass-Steagall being in place right now means that they need to be broken up. And so again, I think a part of this is the conversation that we have as Americans in the course of this presidential campaign, and the quality of the appointments that we make, and the direction and the communication from the executive has a real effect, even on agencies that are independent, especially when the people have spoken, and they're ultimately the authority here.
The existing law does give regulators a range of remedies that actually Sheila Bair helped develop, not necessarily with a cheerful support of others in the administration, but there is a range of remedies if the living wills are not credible. They can require increased capital. They can require enhanced supervision. They can have a regulator come sit in their lap. So there are things that can happen if the living will is not a credible resolution plan that would avoid economic catastrophe.
And capital cushions.
And the
Yeah.
Sanders, the question about differentiating yourself from Senator Sanders?
15 years of executive experience. That's my differentiator from everybody running for president and the Democratic Party. 15 years of executive experience as a governor, making appointments. In this case, that's what differentiates me.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Not
you.
that there's anything wrong with serving the Congress.
It's great, and their voices are, and they have experiences I don't have, but I have some they do not.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'm John Cole. From all the candidates, I have not heard a simple solution, which is the DOJ, when they make deals with Bank of America and Bank of America